Now I'd like to turn the meeting over to Patrick Shepard. Thank you. You may begin.
Thanks, Diane. And thank you all for joining us. Welcome to the Advanced Practitioner series. My name is Patrick Shepard, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Cheryl Kane-Piasecki. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thanks very much, Patrick.
So today we're going to be talking about data.
Yes.
And data is really exciting because we get to do math.
My favorite subject.
So yes, today we're going to be talking about using data to make better decisions for our ethics program. And I think as time's gone by, we've found that there are more and more sources of data that we can use. And sometimes it's hard to find time to sort of stop and analyze that data and kind of use it to make decisions. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about, giving you some examples of how you can use data, and also providing you an occasion to maybe revisit some statistics that you might not have seen before.
Yeah, and I think that this is going to answer some questions that folks have had for years about, what utility is the annual questionnaire? What can we glean from the annual questionnaire or similar sort of instruments that we can actually use sort of proactively in our ethics program practices? And so we're hoping to answer some of those questions today. But also, I think our timing is actually really fortuitous, and we didn't necessarily plan this, but it just so happens that on September 26th, the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking came out with its recommendations, which are government-wide sort of recommendations, and the GAO just came out on September 29th with its report talking about the need for program evaluations and advocating for agency support for sort of annual agency plans for evaluating programs in order to increase the effectiveness of your program. So this is very de rigueur, it's de la moda, whatever else you want to call it. I mean, this is really sort of what's up and coming in requirements, what the Congress is looking to, what OMB is looking to, is ways that we can take data and any source of data that we have and use it in a meaningful, evaluative way to inform the decision-making about our programs. And so we're going to do some of that today.
Absolutely. And we're going to talk about some sources of data that you might not be familiar with.
Yes.
So we're all familiar with the annual ritual of the annual agency ethics program questionnaire.
Yes. I have to do that every year for OGE.
You're used to the chore of filling out that form and receiving a report and attending a broadcast where we share with you some highlights. This year, we're actually really fortunate to have some additional data. So we can not just measure how we think we're doing or how we've reported ourselves doing, but we also have an opportunity to look at some data that was collected by the Merit Systems Protection Board. They conduct periodically a very large-scale survey of a representative sample of the executive branch. I believe they send this to 10,000 officials.
Yeah, so this is big data. This is big data that we get from this survey.
Right, and in the last iteration of this survey, OGE was able to work with them to get some ethics questions inserted into the survey. And we got a really good response rate, and we've published that section of responses, the sort of top line data for those questions, along with the broadcast and the materials. And I'd really, really encourage you guys to take a close look at this. It's only 15 or 20 questions. It's not a huge document, but I think it contains some real surprises. It contains maybe some things that make us feel good about how we're doing, some things that maybe show us where we could be doing better. It affirms some of our decision making, and it might actually show us that we could think about things a little differently.
Yes, yes.
And additionally, we are also in the Employee Viewpoint Survey season. So your agencies very likely already have the data back from your EVS surveys. If you know the folks who work on that, and you can get the breakdown of the data, I think it's very useful for ethics programs. If you don't know how to get that, the results have to be published to your agency's website by October 20th. So you could probably go find them there as well. But we're going to talk a little bit about why that's important, how we can use that information to maybe identify some risks and maybe make some better decisions for our programs. So today we're really going to focus on synthesis. We're going to talk about how we can use these sources of data in concert to find out how we're doing and make better decisions for our programs, rather than give you a sort of point-by-point walkthrough. And we realize there's risk there because it requires you to actually go dig into this data, take a look. But we hope that the examples we share with you today will maybe get you excited about this idea and give you a sense it's really valuable. It's a very useful way to spend your time, and it can really save you a lot of headache and increase your effectiveness.
And I think at the end of the day, that's really what we're all about here. I think that, quite frankly, we don't spend enough time talking about the effectiveness of our programs. And I think that it's anytime we have an ability to sort of stop and take stock and look not only at how, how our programs are operating from a resource standpoint, like we wish we had more people or we're overwhelmed, but more from the standpoint of what in the program is working, what in the program is not working, what could be improved upon, what are efficiencies that we could achieve by identifying those aspects of the program that maybe don't need as much care and feeding, so that we can release some resources to those parts of the program that do. So this is really all with a view toward making the program work better for you, but also work better for the people that it's serving. So we want to make sure that your program is being effective in that, employees actually are aware of it. Employees, come to you for assistance, that employees feel satisfied when they do come to you for assistance. So this is kind of a win-win-win is really what we're talking about here. So we're hoping that this presentation today will give you some clues about ways that you can start doing a little bit of this diagnostic sort of activity with your own program.
Absolutely. So shall we get into the charts and tables?
Yes, absolutely. Enough talking from us. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'd like to just sort of walk you through some highlights from the various data sources and give you an idea of some ways that you can use this information, and maybe also highlight some things that we were a little bit surprised about. Maybe they don't come to you as a surprise, but there are some things that reading through this information caused me to say, I wouldn't have guessed that. So the first thing we want to talk about, and this is a challenge that you as a community highlight over and over in your questionnaire, in your discussions with your desk officers, and that's the need to really be strategic in the allocation of resources, and really, it's challenging. We're
Right.
all resource constrained. So there are a lot of cases where allocating resources can be really challenging, and it's hard to see where you're getting the best return on investment out of your resource investments. And it's hard to kind of figure out how do you expand that pie
Right.
where you have temporary challenges or maybe challenges that you didn't have before. So we hope some of this information gives you a way to make that argument, but also to make good decisions about where you prioritize your resources.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that you're going to see here today too is when you have hard data that you can present to people who are in a position to afford you additional resources, it makes your case stronger because you actually have the numbers to back it up, and you can actually provide some statistical evaluation that that can help bolster any sort of anecdotal or other type of evidence that you might have to support your request for whatever resources there might be.
Right. So let's start with kind of a simple example, but I think this is a very good example of how you can use the data because there's some real clarity here, and we're able to look at kind of both sides of the balance sheet. What you're looking at now are the results from the Merit Systems Protection Board survey of 10,000 government employees. And the question that they were asked is, have you received ethics training? What format did you have? And if you received it, how effective do you think it was?
Mm-hmm.
And we have some, I think, I found them to be encouraging statistics here, that regardless of format, reference materials, web-based training, and broadcast training all come in at about 60 to 70% effective or very effective,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is good,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're spending a lot of resources in these things, and it's good to see that we're being effective. But one of the anomalies we see here is that the effectiveness of in-person ethics training, we see a 20% jump in the number of surveyed who say that training is very effective.
Mm-hmm.
So for all other forms, we get around 20% of folks who say it's very effective. When we get to in-person training, that jumps to almost 40%.
Right.
That's a big shift.
That's significant. That is a significant difference.
So we can see that there. And what's interesting is this actually comports very well with some of the data that you have provided in the annual questionnaire. We find when we do an analysis of the annual ethics program questionnaire that the most popular kinds of training are in-person classroom instruction and one-on-one briefings, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
That means that we're making decisions as a community that are in concert with the available data. And if you're facing pressure to move to quote unquote more efficient or less resource intensive ways of delivering
Mm-hmm.
training, this is a data point that may be useful to you.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say we were in a different situation, Cheryl. Let's say we were in a program, and so we had a group of employees whose job responsibilities put them at significant risk for ethics challenges. And they're currently receiving maybe written training or web-based training or are watching a recording or something like this. And we want to make the case that what we really need to do is focus on and spend the resources to provide them in-person training because we've seen the change in effectiveness. How might we go about doing that?
Well, I think first of all, what you're describing to me sounds like your high risk pool of employees, which is to say that the people who are most likely to, in their workaday life, be in situations where the possibility for a conflict of interest or the possibility of some sort of ethics violation is not only increased, but the fallout of some of that kind of a violation has tremendous ramifications for the organization. So it seems to me that you can sort of present it in a sort of a return on investment risk analysis kind of way, which is to say in those areas where we have the greatest risk, we want to make sure that we have the greatest possible effectiveness so that we're putting as much manpower into preventing where the risk is most likely and most damaging.
Right.
And we have the data to show that this type of training is going to be more effective in preventing those situations than an alternative form of training.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. We kind of need to start with the business need, right? Why is it important that our employees receive effective ethics training? What are the risks? And when we start with the business need, then we can start looking at cost and benefits. So if we can get agreement and buy-in that this group of employees needs really to receive the most effective ethics training we can provide, or they need to receive effective ethics training because of the possible effect that failure could have on our business, our ability to accomplish mission. So starting with the objective is really important. And then we can go and make a case about effectiveness, right? We can look at costs and benefits. So this is how I think about these things. This is how I kind of break things out. And this may be a little bit of a surprise to you, because I think from our perspective in ethics programs, we tend to see the cost of ethics training all in the production.
Yeah, in the development side, how much of our staff time is going to be dedicated to creating and delivering training? Right.
But actually, what the bulk of the cost to our agencies in training of any kind is in the taking. The employees who spend an hour each year, thousands of employees, tens of thousands of employees, hundreds of thousands of employees spending an hour receiving training is a huge investment. That's an enormous investment. And the investment that an employee makes in attending online training versus in-person training is identical, right? There's no change in how long it takes for an employee to spend an hour receiving training. So here we have sort of a cost breakdown in hours. And here we're assuming a class of 30 employees, which is a relatively small group for in-person training. And this would scale. So, if we had to do 100 classes of 30 people or 10 classes of 30 people or 3, the ratios would be the same here.
Right.
So the additional cost in the delivery here would be 1 additional instructor. So we'd have 31 employee hours to train 30 employees for 1 hour. Versus an online training, we would have 30 employee hours for 30 hours of training. So that's an increase of about 3% in terms of resources. And we've held steady here the development costs. Cheryl and I have both developed both online training, the sort of click-through training, as well as prepared for in-person training. Depending on your authoring suite, I find usually online training is more resource intensive to produce than in-person training. But to sort of be charitable here and not complicate things, we've held those level. So we've assumed that the development time is the same. So our cost is an increase of 3.3 employee hours. So how about effectiveness? Well, if we look at the previous data from the MSPB survey, we find that 1 hour of in-person training is rated as 80% effective or very effective. So when we sum those two categories together, we get 80%. Online, we find 67% of employees reported being effective or very effective, with a bias towards merely effective versus very effective. So we get an increase of 13% in reported effectiveness. So for a 3.3% increase in investment, we get a 13% increase in effectiveness. It's almost a 300% return on investment. There aren't many places that you can do that.
Yes, that's astonishing.
Right? So, you know, we didn't know this before. We had a feeling that this was the case. It seems the community has had this feeling for a while, because you've reported for years on end that this is the most common form of training that you provide. But I think what we can see here is that we're right. Right? That our instinct is correct, that the data support that conclusion. And importantly, they provide us a way to share this, right? We can share this information in a way that others who are not experienced ethics trainers can understand. So we have support in that area. And in fact, this is very much in accord with a lot of the private sector information and research being done as well. So this really shouldn't come as a surprise to us. And
I mean, I think it follows too what we've said every time we've talked about training, and the importance of training is that, you know, given the sheer quantity of time and the sheer number of people that are required to receive this training, you really can't afford to have your training be ineffective. It's a waste of resources, and it's a squandering of resources that no program can afford. So I think that anytime you can increase your effectiveness rate with a modicum of investment of resources, the return on investment, you know, not just numerically, but I mean, like in terms of actual
sort of substantive
return is immeasurable.
Right. No, so I thought that was really interesting, and this is just sort of an example. There are other data sets that you could use in a very, very similar way, and we'll take a look at some of those that are interesting in just a moment here. So that's one way we can sort of prioritize our resources, decide where to spend, and decide where we're getting the greatest return on investment. But something else we all report is that getting resources is really hard.
Yes. Everybody wants more resources.
Everyone wants more resources. And in many cases, when we're trying to request resources, how we frame our request, how specific we can be about the need and what is required to meet the need, puts us in a much more powerful position to request resources.
And I think if you can provide a sort of like a cornucopia, as it were, of alternatives, where it isn't just I need another FTE, but if you have some more specific or a variety of ways to suggest that, you know, use of some resources of some available resource that doesn't necessarily have to be a full-time employee, you know, the stronger your argument can be.
No, absolutely.
Because everybody's arguing for more FTE. So, you know, there may be things short of an FTE that you can negotiate for that will get you the resources you need.
Great. So here we're looking at some top-line results from the annual questionnaire. So this is the data you provided. It may not hold true for your program, but you could look to your own response to see where you are on the program side. In that way, the annual questionnaire can really help serve as a program self-assessment, you know, an opportunity to reflect on how you're doing, how your resources are keeping up with demand, etc. But from the top-line results, we're able to see some interesting trends. First, we see the areas where we say we spend the most time are advice and counsel, confidential financial disclosure, and public financial disclosure. Something that jumps out at me in these three areas is that two of them are seasonal.
Yes.
Right? Two of these aren't ongoing at the same rate all year. There's maybe a slow burn all year, but the big majority of the work is seasonal. And that is actually a great opportunity for us when we're advocating for resources. We can juxtapose this with our question in question 13 in the annual questionnaire is what resources do programs say they need? And many programs, not a majority, but the largest group of programs reporting needing more resources say they need human capital, need people. And also we get some insight into what kinds of advice and counseling. We can get a breakdown of the kinds of advice and counseling that people spend the most time with. So within advice and counseling, folks say gift acceptance is a major area. And then they said financial disclosure reporting is next. So where we say we have financial disclosure, advice and counsel, well, a huge part of the advice and counsel is also financial disclosure, which is also seasonal.
Right.
But there are lots of things we could do with this information if this is our situation. One of them is to advocate for additional administrative support, maybe people who can triage technical reporting questions or help employees with reporting systems during the filing season.
Right.
You don't need a full-time staff member. You might be able to borrow someone from another area in the general counsel's office or someone in a sister office to you to help you through that deluge that happens to us every year at the beginning of the year and then in the spring. Likewise with gifts. Some kinds of routine gift acceptance, you might be able to get some assistance. And if you find that your gift advice workload is seasonal, maybe around the holidays or maybe around sort of the conference season for whatever industry your agency is involved in, maybe you could find some additional support there. So this isn't to suggest that that's necessarily your situation, but that you can use this information to think creatively about the resource pie and make discrete and sort of actionable requests for additional resources rather than kind of the generic request of, it would be great if we had an extra FTE.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it. And negotiating sort of MOUs, like if you're in a general law shop, to the extent that there's any sort of sharing of resources among the general law shop, having an MOU with other parts of your general law group, that during the height of your confidential season or the height of your public season, that you get a body who can help you do, as Patrick said, some of the low-hanging fruit maybe, and that would free your folks up to do the more complicated stuff.
Absolutely. And we're going to come back to this same data set a little later in the presentation to talk about a different use case. And that's something we really want to emphasize, is there are lots of ways to use this data to make better decisions. So we encourage you to sort of think creatively and kind of step back and think strategically about how we can make improvements based on data. Let's take a look at another set of data. So up here on the top left, we have responses from the annual questionnaire. So 100% of you responding to the annual questionnaire said your agency's leadership. And that means the agency head, senior executives, first-line managers demonstrate support for the ethics program. And you subsequently report that 65% of you had a meeting in the last year with your agency leadership to talk about strengths and weaknesses of the ethics program. Those numbers on their own, positive. I think the support number is absolutely positive. On number 15, maybe it would be nice if that was higher, if we had more frequent discussions about the strengths and weaknesses. But then when we look at the MSPB data, we find some discord.
Yes.
Where generally employees agree that senior leaders communicate the importance of ethical behavior, that percentage is only around 70%, which means a third or more of our employees aren't seeing it. Now, this could be for all sorts of reasons. And in fact, this is a very common occurrence when we've looked at some of the research done in the private sector and the corporate sector, that there is a difference between the way employees view the sort of ethical commitments of their leaders and the way leaders view their own commitments.
Exactly.
And in some ways, that shouldn't be surprising to us.
Right. Well, and I think that, what I would also suggest in light of that, when you look at that statistic, then I think it gives us all pause to go back to question 14 on the annual questionnaire and think to ourselves in a very honest way, when we answered yes to that question, what specifically did we have in mind in the way of exactly how our agency leadership is demonstrating the support for the ethics program? Because I think that the way that the leaders of the agency communicate support, not just for the program and your program, but for for ethics throughout the organization, that's the communication that employees are going to hear. And that's the statistic that you're looking at there from the MSPB case, which is in many instances, they're not hearing it or they're not seeing it. So that's the kind of evidence that you could use to sort of bolster support for your agency leadership engaging in a communication strategy, for example, with your assistants that would, not only allow you to answer yes to question number 14, but that would also raise those statistics on people's perception of agency leadership's commitment to ethics.
Right. And so it's really nice to have this MSPB data because, as you mentioned, we can use this as an occasion to reflect on how we're doing in this area and maybe a reason to have a discussion about how we could improve that situation. When we look later on at some of the questions in the Employee Viewpoint Survey, that's another source of data that can help to inform how our agency specifically is doing or areas within our agencies. We don't have that data yet, so we've not shared it with you in this section of the presentation. But as that comes out, after you get access to that, you can use it in the same way. You can ask yourself, you can find out how your employees feel about the support for ethical behavior in your agency amongst leadership. And you can have a frank discussion, a serious discussion about how we feel about that number. And if as an agency, you think you'd like to improve it, what are some ways you can do that? So I think another way we can use these to allocate resources is to sort of find out if we're within tolerance, if our numbers are at a level that's acceptable to our leadership. So I think this area was the most surprising to me.
This next area?
This next area, we're talking about advice and counsel and employees' perceptions and behaviors in that area. So again, we mentioned that this is a survey of about 10,000 employees. And you can see up here at the top that about 90%, 89% of employees surveyed who responded, and they had a very high response rate here, said that they understood there were officials in their agencies whose job included providing advice on ethics issues.
Okay, so almost 90% of the agency knows that they
have an ethics officer.
They have an ethics officer, yes. Okay.
And then about 90% of that 90% knows how to get in touch with that person.
Right.
So we get about 80% of folks, just under 80% of folks who know how to get in touch with their ethics officer. That should maybe give us a little bit of concern.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at a fifth of the surveyed population didn't know how to get in touch with the ethics office. In the size of government, I mean, if this is a representative sample and we extrapolate that out, that's a significant percentage, and that's I think an uncomfortable percentage of people who don't know how to contact the ethics office.
And I was reflecting on this a little earlier. And I think this actually comports pretty well with some of our experience in agencies as ethics officials. Something that always happens after training, whether it's online training or in-person training, whenever you have your sort of annual training campaign or campaigns, so you get a big bump in the amount of requests for advice and counsel. We've all experienced that, which suggests that training serves as a reminder and people all of a sudden remember how to get in touch with us, so they reach out to us for advice. The fact that doesn't persist through the entire year suggests that maybe they forget. So that maybe our frequency of reminding folks how to get in touch with us could be improved. So, again, this is something to think about.
I think sometimes if we can simplify the ways to get in touch with us as well. I mean, and I know that for smaller agencies, that's maybe a little bit more difficult, but I don't know. I'm just thinking in terms of having a central email that people could send questions to, or something where they don't have to know specifically the contact information of a particular individual, particularly if those positions, roll over at all,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
centralized email account, all sorts of awareness building kind of things and reminders can be helpful here. So of those 10,000 folks, about 2,000 of them asked for advice. And the good news is most of those people thought the advice was pretty helpful. They rated it as helpful or very, very helpful to about 70%. So maybe that's not ideal, but that's certainly a positive. It's on the positive side. So that's not a huge population of folks reaching out for advice. Of the 10,000, we have about 2,000. And here's where I found the greatest area of surprise was where else people are getting ethics advice and how effective they feel advice from these sources is.
I don't necessarily find it surprising. I think what sort of gobsmacks you is it kind of affirms maybe some of your worst fears about how people are actually going about doing this on a day-to-day basis. But I'm not terribly surprised, but it's good to have the numbers to affirm that this is exactly what's happening.
Yeah. So actually more folks went to their immediate supervisor for ethics advice than came to their ethics officer. And they rated that helpfulness slightly below the ethics officer, but not radically below the ethics officer. A very large percentage of folks, nearly half as many, a little more than half as many who went to an ethics official, went to a supervisor above their immediate supervisor, so maybe their boss's boss. We see a slight reduction in helpfulness, but overall sort of about the same. And then another 1,100 people, which again is a little more than half of the folks who sought advice from an ethics officer, saw some other supervisor.
Exactly. Who is this mysterious other supervisor? A goodly number of people are going there, though.
Yeah, so that's maybe surprising, but that's a lot of folks who are receiving ethics advice from someone other than an ethics official. And this is maybe even more surprising. A lot of folks are receiving advice from the Human Resources Office.
Wow.
And a very significant number from a colleague.
Now that's not surprising, though.
It's not. So I think this information has there's a lot for us to consider, and there are a lot of things we could think about doing with it. I think our first instinct would be to increase our visibility, so maybe more of these folks would come to us.
Yeah.
But I think there are also lots of lessons in here for our training of supervisors.
Yes, I agree.
If we're not training supervisors to triage ethics questions, to direct employees to us when there's any ambiguity, we should be doing that, because this data shows us very clearly that supervisors are receiving and apparently answering ethics questions.
Yeah, and we might dislike that, but that's the fact of the matter. And we can stomp our feet all we want and suggest that this shouldn't be happening, but it is. So I think that the rational sort of approach to this is to say, in light of the fact that we have supervisors answering these questions, we need to equip those supervisors in the best possible way to, in the first instance, to, when they identify it as an ethics issue, maybe farm it to the ethics shop. But in the absence of that, for them at least to know when they might be adequately enough equipped to answer the question and when they really probably shouldn't be even attempting to answer the question, so that you're giving them tools to know when they're not only maybe putting their employee in jeopardy, but they're putting themselves in jeopardy by attempting to answer a question that's really they're not really qualified to answer.
And I think there's also some opportunity here when we think back to those areas we identified as the biggest draws on the ethics program resources, some of those seasonal things. If we could equip supervisors to answer some of the most common financial disclosure reporting questions.
Yes.
If we know that employees are going to go to their supervisor anyway, and we can provide them the top 10 reporting issues to advise employees, we could, one, save ourselves some time. It's relatively low risk because eventually we're going to see those reports and be able to correct any misapprehensions. But we also might be able to reduce some of that volume. This might be another place where we can use other resources. And it also gives us an opportunity to explain the difference between ethics questions that supervisors are maybe equipped to handle and those which they should be referring along to us.
Well, and the overarching sort of positive that comes out of that is the more that you can have supervisors engaged in having these kind of conversations with their employees, and have supervisors sort of understand that that's kind of part of their portfolio of things that involve supervising, employees. You're sending a very strong message to employees that ethics matters. And there's research out there that just demonstrates without question that the more employees hear that kind of messaging from their immediate supervisors and from the people in their supervisory chain of command, the stronger that their perception that they are actually operating in an ethical culture. So there's a lot that you can reap from having that kind of involvement by supervisors that goes beyond merely accomplishing the task at hand.
Absolutely. And we also get some sort of qualitative data. This survey provides us some insight into employees' feelings about why they didn't go to the ethics office if they sought advice from someone else. And I think this is worth reflecting upon. So 10% of folks said there isn't any ethics staff.
That's pretty amazing.
And I think if you consider employees who maybe work in the field, it may be the case that there isn't ethics staff in their immediate work area, and they may not be aware that there's someone there to help them. Another 19% didn't know there was an ethics staff, so it's almost 30% Either there isn't any or they didn't know there was any.
Mm-hmm.
And another 3% said that they don't have time for me. So that's a not insignificant percentage of folks who either can't find an ethics officer, don't think one exists, or believe that those people don't have time to help them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that should be something that we want to, think about.
Mm-hmm.
And then the sort of last three groups are maybe more troubling.
Yeah, this is disheartening to me.
There's a lack of confidence. They believe nothing will be done, or they're afraid they would get in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So that may be a training issue. That may be something that you want to cover with supervisors. I think there's lots we can do with this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if I were in an agency, I'd want to sort of check this government-wide data against some of our employee viewpoint questions to see if there are any conclusions that can be drawn from those two data sets in concert. Do we really have a problem with the credibility of the ethics program? Do we have a problem with employees' views of the importance of integrity in our agency? And if we do, that might require some significant interventions.
Yes.
And I think this also gives us a good reason to talk about not just resources, but how we approach these things.
Oh, and again, it gets back to the use of evaluation tools in our own program, because I think what you're seeing from this data is, we have programs to run, and I think we get very much caught up in the the day-to-day activity of accomplishing the discrete tasks that are involved in the ethics program from an administrative point of view. But I think we lose sight of the big picture, which is how are we perceived by our own employees? So I think anytime you have an opportunity to evaluate your employees' perception of the services that they're actually receiving from you, that's just a good place to start. I ultimately would advocate for, doing an agency-wide survey of them, sort of like testing people's perceptions of a lot of aspects of ethical culture, including leadership, including, a whole host of things. But if you don't want to go that broadly, at least not initially, you can certainly fairly easily engage in some evaluative tools of the services that you're actually providing, whether it's for training or whether it's for advice and counsel or for your financial disclosure engagement with your employees, to see how people are, customer service satisfaction kind of thing, to see how you're actually doing.
Absolutely. And I'm aware of some agencies that are doing just that, who send a very short 1 or 2 question survey to anyone who requests advice to see how satisfied they are with the process and the quality of the product they received. You can do the same thing with your training. You can find out how people felt about the training they received by providing a post-training survey. We use them here. We find them to be incredibly valuable. And that, I think this statistic says to me that that's something we should really consider doing. Because if this is the reality government-wide, if I were in an agency, I'd want to know if that's a problem we have here and if that's the way people who are receiving our services feel about those services. And if it is, we need to do something about it.
Exactly.
So that's allocating resources, thinking about problems and where to prioritize your resource use, as well as advocating for support from other parts of the agency, is a really good use for the data. We can also use this kind of data to help us determine how we should develop our staff members. If you are at a larger agency and you have a number of staff members, you're trying to decide what their training priorities should be for the coming year. If you do individual development plans or that kind of work, we can use these data to help us make better decisions about staff development. So this is a shocking, scary statistic. So as of December 31st, 2016, 68% of DAOs were eligible for retirement.
So there should be a lot of succession planning going on out in the community.
So if your agency is in this bucket and you're not doing succession planning, this might be a good reminder to start. And I think we have found at OGE that disruption in the leadership of ethics programs is disruptive. When there's a change in leadership of the program, especially without good succession planning, that's an area where programs can move backwards in effectiveness and compliance rates and all sorts of things. So I think this is a real danger area. So just that one top line number sort of shouts at me that we should still be thinking about succession planning. We've been talking about it for many years, But I think we're still in the midst of that concern.
And then you look at, I mean, if you can go back there, no, okay, I know, I was misreading the statistic.
Oh, sure.
No, go ahead.
And then we can come back to where we spend our time. So we looked at this before, and we looked at it in the context of advocating for resources or allocating resources, but it can also help you with staff development. So if you know that a very large percentage of your questions center around financial disclosure, we can train more reviewers. We can train people to assist employees in helping filers to complete their financial disclosure forms. So if you have administrative support folks who want to develop in their careers and learn about more of the substantive ethics, we can use this to prioritize. If we know some of the routine gift acceptance issues take up a lot of time, and that's something that could be given to someone, or we could train someone up to handle that, we can set kind of our training priorities. This might be a good time to remind folks that we have a huge library of on-demand courses that you can utilize internally to your program to help new folks get up to speed, or folks to take on new responsibilities. So we'd encourage you to use the data in that way also. And again, we find a sort of similar pattern here, that we're talking about gift acceptance, financial disclosure, and you can look at your own agency questionnaire to determine if this is your situation, and if it's not, you can use your own priorities, or the places where you actually spend resources to set staff training priorities, and maybe increase the effectiveness of the pool of resources that you have at your discretion. And so finally, we want to talk about identifying risk areas. And this is kind of an interesting area because it allows us to sort of see into the future a little bit by looking into the past. And what I want to do is sort of walk us through some of the questions in the Employee Viewpoint Survey, some of which jump out at you as possible ethics questions, and some of them maybe it's not obvious what the connection is. But I think all of these can be really helpful in seeing culturally how our agency is doing. You know, how do employees feel about the work environment? And you know, it's important for us to be aware of that so we can provide services to sort of help people where they are. So I think what we've seen in a lot of recent research is that employee disposition, their feelings about the work environment, have a big effect on the risk of ethical lapses.
Culture is one of the key contributors, and perception of culture is one of the key contributors to people's overall impression of the organization itself and the ethical health of the organization itself. But again, people's predisposition to either sort of themselves believe that ethical conduct is rewarded and valued, but also it plays a goodly part in their willingness to report any misconduct that they see. So it has a deleterious effect overall on people's perception of the integrity of the organizations that they work for. And I'm sure that on some level, I'm not sure that it's measured in any of the statistics that we've seen, but I'm sure it can't help but, you know, read down to maybe, you know, affecting the quality of the work that people do. If people are suffering from low morale because they think they work in an organization that is ethically compromised, I would imagine it's not a great leap of imagination that that's affecting the work that they're doing as well.
So I think this question, sort of its applicability is obvious. You know, people's feelings about disclosure of wrongdoing. I think, you know, we don't think of ourselves as being in the whistleblower protection business, but this is really important to the effectiveness and the overall sort of feeling about the seriousness of ethics in organizations. If significant numbers of people feel like they cannot raise suspected violations, I think that's a serious red flag. That's something we really want to keep an eye on. Yeah,
then they don't think they don't think they're operating in a safe environment, and that's just not good, period. And just before you move off of that, sure, Patrick, I don't want to spend too much time, but this kind of goes hand in hand with some of the statistics we saw about people's reluctance to go seek ethics advice as well. I was very disturbed to see that anybody thought that they didn't want to go to the ethics office to seek ethics advice because they thought they would get in trouble. I think that's a concern, right, a real concern. And I think to the extent that there's any kind of a perception that the ethics office is not a safe place to go talk about anything, that would need to be addressed.
Absolutely. And I think when we're thinking about employee viewpoint survey scores, agencies often prioritize improving employee viewpoint scores, employee engagement. And there may be teams of people at your agencies that are involved in efforts to improve employee morale and the responses that they provide in this survey. And that provides us another enormous opportunity to make our programs relevant to the broader organization. If we can seek those people out and say, look, we've reviewed these, we have some concerns, we understand you're trying to change those perceptions or improve things, we might have some tools to help the agency do that. I think that's an opportunity for us to demonstrate our relevance to the greater management of the agency. And I think this is an area where there's a lot of overlapping, right? If we're going to move the needle on a question like this, that requires involvement of first line supervisors, of senior leaders, of leadership of the ethics office, maybe of the inspector general's office. It's going to take more than one program to sort of remedy any deficiencies in a situation where this was a low score. So I think this might give you an opportunity to work with others to make some positive changes in your organization. Likewise, how people feel about the role of partisan political purposes or arbitrary action based thereon, I think is an indicia, right? If you have a low score in this area, people feel like they work in a coercive environment. That's another red flag that we want to think about. And again, correcting this is probably not going to be something that you could do just from the ethics office, right? That takes an agency to work together to create that kind of environment.
Prohibited personnel practices. This is totally an ethics issue. And all of the data that we are seeing and the research that's being done in organizational culture, that's, a lot of it's been done on the corporate side, but we're seeing in academic research as well. The notion of sort of like organizational justice or sort of fairness in the organization, the perspective that people have that people are, for the most part, treated fairly, that there isn't arbitrariness, that there isn't illegal discrimination, that there aren't knowing violations of personnel practices that go unchecked. Those are all things that hugely weigh in on people's perceptions of the ethical climate in the organizations that they work for.
Absolutely. And the way you can use this in a risk management framework, a lot of agencies request their employee viewpoint scores be broken down based on component. So you may be able to make comparisons even within your organization. So if your agency has requested that data, you can look for kind of hot spots, right? If you see an office or an organization that stands out because people feel like the personnel practices are unfair, that's maybe somewhere you want to focus extra resources or make sure that you're doing management training or partner with others in your organization to craft some other kind of intervention. But I think if you have the data from across the organization and you can see outliers, those outliers can be a good early warning to possible risks to your agency. I think this one, the applicability here is pretty obvious.
Yeah.
So this is an opportunity for us to sort of check the feelings that we report in the annual questionnaire. So 100% of DAOs said that they're supported by leadership. We can find out if our employees agree. We can find out if they agree across the organization or if some areas they maybe feel less. And this can be another occasion for a discussion or an occasion to think about changing what we're doing in our programs, changing how our leaders express their support for agency ethics. I think this is another one.
Yeah.
Do people have respect for their organization's leaders? And I think, again, this gets to the culture piece. It's very hard to have employees who are supportive and believe the organization is supportive of ethics and integrity when they don't have respect for their senior leaders. And if this is another place, if you see hotspots in your organization where there's, an outlier, that may be another indicia that we need to take a look there. So this is just 3 data sets, and I think I want to take this opportunity to sort of share with you some thoughts that we have, because I think what we've learned from looking at some of the data that is available and looking at some of the data outside of the government that's been collected in the corporate sector, is that we can do better. we can evaluate the effectiveness of specific interventions. We can evaluate the effectiveness of programs. We can evaluate the effectiveness of discrete services that our agencies provide to improve ethics programs. So something that we're just in the very sort of early stages of doing is thinking about ways that we can use data to assess the effectiveness of interventions. So an example of that is our annual training push and our new employee orientation training push. We had a methodology, and we're sort of happy to see that agencies are doing in-person training and that employees are reporting that it's effective. But we think there are other opportunities that we can maybe find better ways to move compliance in financial disclosure or training attendance or perceptions of effectiveness of ethics programs. So we're really interested. If you're interested in collecting data about your program to make better decisions, if you're interested in measuring sort of A/B testing different tools that your agency is using to find out which is most effective, we'd be very interested in working with you, maybe help you construct some of those experiments.
And we do mean experiments. We're very keen to sort of see if there are ways that we could do some very low cost interventions that would help us see to what extent, for example, is just to give you an example, like to what extent is having a supervisor issue the reminder to file a financial disclosure, does that have any effect on the response rate and the timeliness of filing? So trying to take some of the research that we found where we know that there are certain pressure points in an organization or certain parts of the organization that are more capable of influencing behavior of employees, and sort of leveraging those points to see if we can't get better results. And not just for the sake of the administrative aspects of our program, but also hopefully with a view toward engaging all aspects of the organization in equally supporting the goal of having, an ethical culture within the organization. So the long view is these are all sort of ways that we can increase employees' perception of the integrity of your organization. But along the way, if there are efficiencies that we can achieve in the actual programmatic aspects, we would like to come in and maybe, help you craft some experiments to see what does and doesn't move the needle on things like timely disclosure or,
And I think there's a tendency for us to sort of separate the administrivia from the sort of substance effectiveness of what we do. But where we can find efficiencies in the administration of a program, we free up resources to do things like in-person training. Right. We might be able to get to 100% timely filing for our 450s in a very resource-intensive way. But if there's a less resource-intensive way to get the same result, the delta between those resources can be reallocated towards something that really, improves the quality of our programs. So, we're sort of serious about efficiencies, and I think we're in a budget environment where efficiencies are absolutely essential for programs to remain effective. We got to figure out a way to sort of squeeze the maximum amount of effectiveness out of the resources we have so that we can free ourselves up to do the really important work. So if you're interested in helping us and helping the greater community, do let us know. Get in touch with Cheryl or I, or send a note to training registrations where you got the instructions, because we are going to try and do some of this and sort of report out and maybe give you a better way of doing something. So thank you all very much for joining us. We hope you found this helpful. This presentation, as always, will be available in its recorded form immediately upon the conclusion. And we have just a minute left, so if we have any questions, we'd like to open the phones up for those.
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question, please press *1. You'll be prompted to record your name. To withdraw your request, please press *2. One moment, please, to see if we have any questions or comments. And again, if you do have any questions, please press *1 and record your name. I show no questions.
Good. Looks like we don't have any questions. If you think of something, or you want to talk about the data, or you have ideas about ways we could use it, do get in touch with us, because we're really interested in growing in this area, and we hope it helps you administer your programs better. That's ultimately the goal, is to be more effective. Well,
and I guess I would also ask you, as someone who actually has to fill out the annual questionnaire for OGE as the alternate DAO, to be very thoughtful, not only in how you're answering the question for purposes of reporting out on your actual data sets, but be thinking about those questions with the viewpoint of, I'm answering it in this way. What is that saying about my resource allocations in my program? So taking the answers to the questions that you're providing, because you're crafting your own data set there, but looking at your own data and saying, well, what does this mean for my program? Even if you don't necessarily at that moment have it to sort of analyze against somebody else's programs as a sort of a benchmark,
right.
You at least know where the places are in your own program that need perhaps some tweaking, or where you could use some extra resources. So I know that's an exercise that, particularly if you have a decentralized program, that it's the data collection on that can be painful. But I think all the more reason to look at it as an opportunity to have some hard data that you can actually make use of.
Right. Yeah, make it a useful exercise.
Right.
Maximize the utility of that exercise, because it's time you're going to spend one way or the other.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for joining us, and we hope you'll complete your course evaluations. And if you have thoughts for things that you'd like us to talk about in the future, we are always looking for ideas, and we will see you next time.
Okay. Thank you.